Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee to Harvard Bookstore to discuss his book, The Emperor of All Maladies. Dr. Mukherjee is a cancer physician and researcher at Columbia University Medical Center, as well as a professor of medicine at Columbia. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Mukherjee graduated from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard Medical School. His writing has appeared in Nature, the New England Journal of Medicine, the New York Times, and the New Republic. The Emperor of All Maladies is his first book. Dr. Mukherjee subtitled his book A Biography of Cancer, and he provides the reader the story of the disease from its earliest recorded history in ancient Egypt up through the modern era. In the thousands of years that humankind has been aware of the disease, attitudes about cancer and approaches to its treatment have changed greatly. The prominence cancer holds in modern culture would have been unimaginable only 100 years ago, when the disease was considered shameful. Dr. Mukherjee also writes about his own experience treating cancer, providing a unique insight into the ongoing fight against what he terms our desperate, malevolent, contemporary doppelganger. Publishers Weekly called the book a sweeping epic of obsession, brilliant researches, dramatic new treatments, euphoric success, and tragic failure. It's time to welcome a new star into the constellation of great doctor writers, wrote the Washington Post, going on to call The Emperor of All Maladies enthralling, juicy, scholarly, and wonderfully written. And just today, the New York Times named The Emperor of All Maladies one of the 10 best books of the year, so that's very exciting.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. My introduction began at 5 in the morning when I got this phone call about the New York Times, so I'm a little bit groggy, but it was wonderful. This bookstore holds a very special place in my heart because much of this book was actually written just across from here at Lamont Library. That was my chosen space of work. I used to sit in the windows, and every evening that I would write or finish any work, I would usually take a winding road back to my house, which usually almost always involved a stop here and a slight unloading of my wallet. And I was I lived in Cambridge for 13 years, and I would say in a 1 mile vicinity of Harvard Bookstore, and I think some of that was conscious because I really am attached to this particular bookstore, but to bookstores in general, and I'm very happy to support it in any manner or form. For tonight, I thought I would do a couple of things. One is that I'd like to talk more about the book than read from it, partly because that's an experience that you can't get from reading the book. And so I'll do a couple of small readings from the book, but really I want to talk about how the book was written and why it was written and sort of what the overall global story is. And I hope I'm obviously not going to give away any piece of it, but I hope to convey the sense of what the book is. And to start, I think one thing that struck me very early on, Nan Graham, who was my editor in writing this book, said to me that in the end, the entire paraphernalia of the book world, including bookstores and editors and publishers and designers, etc., are merely tools to get one author sitting alone in a room to communicate with one reader sitting alone in a room. And if you forget that for a second, you are unable to write a book. And that struck me as very important because in some sense, that is also the practice of medicine. In the end, if you take the entire paraphernalia of $1 million hospital and its CAT scans and MRIs and thousands of dollars of technology poured in every second, in the end, the practice of medicine occurs between one person sitting in a room and another person sitting hopefully in the same room. But nonetheless, and I think there's an important parallel there. And that parallel is really what motivates this kind of book. And that parallel is storytelling. That parallel is that much like writing a book is a communication between, as I said, one person and another person through a story. Medicine at its best begins with storytelling. And if you cannot tell a story, the practice of medicine breaks down. And so in a very, very fundamental sense, right at the beginning of writing this book, I acknowledge that. But also right in the beginning of writing this book, I felt that this should be a story. And if one could not construct a story of what has happened in our lives against cancer, for the last 4,000 years, then there was something wrong, because this had to be a story. This could be nothing but a story, because of course this is a story of many characters across a vast amount of time, but nonetheless its narrative quality was very crucial. And so I started one of the very early devices that was used in this book is to find the stories of patients. Whenever I felt the pulse of the book drop, at any point of time, the answer was always find the story of the patient, forget for a moment about the advancement, forget for a moment about the science, because that comes secondary. That's a secondary achievement. And what is really, really central to all of this is, of course, the story. So I'm going to begin I'm going to tell you some of these stories. I can't tell you all of them. The book follows, as Chip McGrath pointed out in the Times, the book doesn't follow a linear structure. It will bounce back. It will move between characters and times, moving back sometimes 4,000 years, switching back forward 4,000 years. But the reason it's all connected, of course, is that medicine and science is also having a conversation with its past. So every time you perform, I say at one point of the time in the book, I say scientists are actually more obsessed with history than perhaps even historians, because there is no discipline that I can think of which is so deeply dependent on history. We always think of science as a futuristic discipline, but really it isn't. It is a discipline obsessed with, immersed in its past. And it has to be, because you're conversing always back. You're conversing. When I perform an experiment today, I'm actually conversing back to someone who did it 5 years ago, and that person was actually conversing back to Galileo, or whoever else was sitting in some other point of time, writing, trying to explain or trying to create a journey through time. And so again, much like that first analogy that I gave you between a patient and a doctor and a writer and as a storyteller, there's also, of course, a storytelling element in science, except now in science story, it occurs to its past. It tells a story not to a person in the physical present, but a person in the temporal past. And that was also a very important piece of the book. So the first story I thought I would tell you is very early on, one of the characters in the book, and I won't follow the linear narrative, but one of the characters in the book, one of the central characters in the book is Sidney Farber. And early on, I had to make a decision to have a single narrator, a skeleton, on whom a 4,000-year-old history could be hung. And that's obviously a difficult question. How do you hang such an enormous history on a single person or a single story? And one thing that was particularly important about Sidney Farber, and it's the following. Sidney Farber was a pathologist. He was born in 1903. He was called a doctor of the dead because pathologists usually perform autopsies. They usually don't treat. They usually diagnose. And they're part of the great ancillary services, the kind of invisible medicine that sits in every hospital. And Farber was a very prominent pathologist. He was a children's pathologist. And he became very interested in a disease called acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It's a children's disease. It's a form of leukemia, a very aggressive form of leukemia, for the following reason. In a world before CAT scans and MRIs, quantifying the size of an internal tumor was impossible, nearly impossible. But leukemia could be measured because it was a tumor of the blood. And you could draw out a droplet of blood. You could look under a microscope and say, well, there are more cells or less cells. And science always begins with measurement. As soon as you perform a measuring activity of any kind, that is already a scientific activity. And so Farber knew this. He had inherited this idea from his predecessors. Others knew it too. So he knew that if something was to be done around cancer, he might as well start with one of its most measurable forms, and therefore he gravitated towards acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The other reason was, of course, that this was a disease that was surgically unamenable. Surgeons couldn't operate on blood. You can't take blood out, obviously. So there was it was, as the book points out, the leukemia itself was like a pariah between disciplines. The hematologists, the doctors of the blood, passed it on to the oncologists, and the oncologists passed it back to the hematologists, and the children were sort of stuck in this between space. And so it was that was another advantage. It was a disease that had nothing, it was sort of a pariah between disciplines. Actually, not unlike Farber himself. He was also moving between pathology and medicine all the time. And so Sidney Farber had a very key insight, and that is that he imagined that there were chemicals in the world that could turn off or selectively kill cancer cells while sparing normal cells. And this was a very important insight, the so-called penicillin for cancer. This was a time when America was just emerging out of, this is 1947, 1948, just emerging out of the sort of the late tail of the war. And it was a moment actually very important in the history of cancer, because cancer is a silent disease, it's an invisible disease. There's an important anecdote in the book when Fanny Rosenau, a breast cancer advocate, calls up the New York Times, and she says, I'm a breast cancer survivor. I would like to have a group of people who a meeting group of breast cancer survivors. And there's a long hold, and the Times editor puts her on hold, and then the Society editor comes on the phone. And Fanny Rosenau is puzzled, and the Society editor says, well, Ms. Rosenau, you know, we can't print the word breast cancer in the Times. What if we said that this was a meeting of women with diseases of the chest wall? So this is 1950. This is the atmosphere that Farber is working in. He's looking for a chemical that will turn on or turn off these malignant cells, and he finds an important ally, and that ally is a man named Yella Subbarao, kind of interestingly forgotten in medical history, and an Indian doctor who had come to Boston. He had actually applied for a fellowship in the School of Tropical Health and Medicine, and not realizing that actually Boston was far from tropical. So this is true. He came from Madras. He came on a boat. Landed up here in the middle of the winter, almost really froze to death his first winter. He lived in a kind of garret underneath a house in Brooklyn. I've been to his Brookline. I've been to his apartment. And Yella Subbarao was denied tenure at Harvard, and then went off to a pharmaceutical company up north in New York, and was synthesizing these chemicals, which turned out to be precisely the chemicals that Farber was looking for. So these were chemicals called antifolates. Farber had figured out that folic acid was one of the chemicals that leukemia cells required for their growth. So leukemia cells were very dependent on the growth of folic acid, and therefore an antifolate, an antagonist to folic acid, would perhaps act as a chemotherapeutic drug. And he then contacted Yella, who was up north. Actually, Farber was one of Yella's few friends while he was in Boston. He contacted Yella, and Yella sent him his first vials of this new drug, this antifolate called aminopterin. And Farber, without actually really knowing very much, just rolled up his sleeves, and he began to inject these tremendously ill kids with these antifolates. And he saw these brief, tantalizing remissions. These children, 2 or 3 years old. By the way, this is the time when I had my daughter was 3. So I had a very emotional connection to all of this, and I had been in the wards and seen 3-year-old children with lymphoblastic leukemia, and now, as I'll tell you later, I'm going to split the suspense a second. This is a curable disease. This is a disease that carries an 80 or 90% cure rate. But it was 100% lethal in Farber's time, and he began to inject these children with antifolates. And he saw these tantalizing remissions. The kids would go and have a remission 5 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then they would relapse and die again. And so here comes a little personal story, which is not in the book, which is that now, this I knew. I had constructed these pieces of history from talking to Farber's family, from picking up records. There's a paper trail. But now, who was the first child to be treated? And where did this child exist? So in the papers, Farber refers to this child as a child called RS, and then my quest became Find RS, because I felt as if I couldn't write this book if I couldn't find RS. RS was going to be the central character in my book, but how does one find him? This child lived for 4 months after Sidney Farber injected him with antifolates and then died afterwards. So I began to put in advertisements on listservs around Boston. I thought, maybe the parents were alive. Maybe I knew the child had a twin who didn't have leukemia, interestingly, called ES. So I kept putting out little ads saying that, if you're ES, you happen to have a brother who had leukemia in 1948, please contact me. If you have a parent, if you had a father, any connection. And there was nothing. There was no response. So I got dejected, and I went actually to India to my parents' house for a vacation. And someone told me Yella, remember Yella, the chemist. Someone told me Yella's biographer and friend lived 2 or 3 blocks from my parents' house in India. So I said, fine, since I'm not doing nothing except writing this book obsessively every day, might as well go and visit Yella's biographer. So I went to Yella's biographer, and Yella's biographer tells me that, and we had a long conversation. At the end of the conversation, he says, well, I was at Farber's Institute, and I met Dr. Farber in 1952 or 53, and while I was there, I was taking notes, and actually he gave me a roster of all the patients that he was treating for leukemia. And in that roster, if you look through the roster, he kept little cuttings, was an article from the Boston Sunday Herald from 1948 containing the picture of Robert Sandler. And so that picture is reproduced in the book. It's actually one of the first pictures of the book. And in fact, the book is dedicated to Robert Sandler 1945 to 48 and to those who came before and after him. That's a great story, but the story gets even crazier because last Friday, when this event was announced, I get a phone call from my publisher who says, you won't believe it, hang on the line. And it's Robert Sandler's mother and his brother. And they contacted me last Friday, and she was crying, and because she had lost, obviously, the one of her twins. The other twin had survived. And she said something very interesting. Actually, I spoke with her son. So through her son, she said something interesting. She said that when the child had died, it was in their faith was not to perform an autopsy. And Sidney Farber apparently begged them to perform an autopsy. And she was really shaken by it. And she had lived, she's 88, I think, or 89. For 86 years after the death of her child, she had lived with the guilt of having submitted her child's body to an autopsy. And she said to me that, but of course that autopsy turns out to be very crucial because it was through autopsies like that Farber finally figured out what the next step was, how to use the next drug in the next remission. And so she said to me, this book really brings that entire story, that 87-year-old open story, to a close, because finally at the end of 87 years, she says, I can now put that idea to rest, that I had allowed my dying my dead son to be opened up for an autopsy. So I thought it was a very moving testament to what books can do at times. So I'm going to now tell you, I'm going to read a little bit from a chapter called Farber's Gauntlet, in which I describe that case. I describe the case. And remember, the only thing, and this is part of, this is part of the part of learning to write for me, was how do you take a paper which is about 2.5 paragraphs long, a case description in the paper, and how do you convert it into something that comes alive, that becomes a story, and what tools do you use so that that Robert Sandler becomes a character, not just a RS in a scientific paper, but a real human being, and his family becomes a real human being. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll do another section, and then we'll stop and take questions. I won't go very long. So here he is. So it turned out that because I knew his name, I could figure out his mother's name. Because it turned out that in the article, his mother's name was listed from the Boston Sunday Herald. So Helen Sandler's name was listed in there. You'll find her picture in the book. For people who have the book, it's in the picture section in the second page. Over here, I'm going to just lift it up and show you. So that's Helen Sandler with the 2 twins. And she... And so I knew, and then because Boston has very good records of death, and because the Boston Public Library is a resource, provides a resource, and actually has not a phone directory, but a directory of addresses from 1948, I could very quickly figure out, and I could figure out where the child had lived, and then in 15 minutes, I could go back. By the way, there's a very important metaphorical quality in the story, which is that the fact that I found this child 1,000 miles away or 6,000 miles away from Boston was very important to me actually in writing the book, because it reminded me about the entire process of anything that happens in the book. You're looking in one direction, you inevitably find things 6,000 miles away, and they get connected up. So it was for me, it was very personally inspiring, because I kept saying to myself, if I can do this, if I can find someone 6,000 miles away, then I can unearth any piece of this history. I mean, with a little bit of luck. So I had figured out, and then by doing this, I figured out where the child had lived, because I could find his address. And by finding his address, I could actually go to the house. And again, this was very important to writing the book. Every time I was stuck, I would often go. So, for instance, in writing about the trials, the Malmo trials, the famous mammography trials in Sweden, which were very important in the history of mammography, I decided that I would go to Malmo, because again, I was stuck, and there's nothing else to, there's no other way to move the book. And it was in Malmo that a woman began to tell me what it was like to undergo the first screening trials of mammography. And if you didn't go to Malmo, you would never discover this. Another example of this is, there's a section in the book which talks about the link between smoking and lung cancer, which was really invisible in the 1950s. People didn't know it. No one suspected it. Had become invisible, actually. And again, to enliven that, I decided that I would go to England, where the link was first discovered, really, to the building where the link was being discovered in the 1950s, in the 1940s and 1950s. And it was only by being in that building you realize what a short distance that building is physically from the shipbuilding and the actuarial industry, the insurance industry of England, which is located in Threadneedle Street. And it turns out that's not a coincidence. It turns out that the very equations that allow us to solve statistical relationships, risks, are in fact borrowed in epidemiology. They're borrowed from the insurance industry, because when a ship was out to sea, the actuaries had to make an estimate what the likelihood of the ship coming back was, and fortunes would be lost when the ship didn't come back or half the cargo sank. And so there were all these assessments of risk being carried out along Threadneedle Street, which were related to the fact is how does one estimate risk? What is a function of risk? And of course that allows us risk is what we measure when we talk about cancer risk, right? When we talk about another story in which unless you physically travel to a space, you would never figure out what the geography is or what its interior landscape is. But back to Robert Sandler. So he lived in Dorchester, as it turned out, and so here is the description that comes out from a collection of going to the space, looking up the weather report where it existed, finding little bits and pieces and interviews, all of which then get put in a big giant grinder and come out as a story, as it were. So 7 miles southwest of the Longwood Hospitals in Boston, the town of Dorchester is a typical sprawling New England suburb, a triangle wedged between the sooty industrial settlements to the west and the gray-green bays of the Atlantic to its east. In the late 1940s, waves of Jewish and Irish immigrants, it happened to be that Sandler's parents were Jewish immigrants, shipbuilders, ironcasters, his father was a shipbuilder, railway engineers, fishermen, and factory workers settled in Dorchester, occupying rows of brick and clapboard houses that snaked their way up Blue Hill Avenue. Dorchester reinvented itself as a quintessential suburban family town with parks and playgrounds along the river, a golf course, a church, and a synagogue. On Sunday afternoons, families converged at Franklin Park to walk through its leafy pathways or watch ostriches, polar bears, and tigers at its zoo. And again, this is drawn from little pieces of news from Dorchester from the 1930s and 1940s and newspaper clippings and so forth. On August 16th, 1947, that day I knew because it was in the paper, in a house across from the zoo, the child of a ship worker in the Boston yards fell mysteriously ill with a low-grade fever that waxed and waned over 2 weeks without pattern, followed by an increasing lethargy and pallor. Robert Sandler was 2 years old. His twin, Elliot, was an active, cherubic toddler in perfect health. So now we pick up from Farber's paper because he begins to describe this because every paper is a case history. So there he is telling his story in scientific terms, which I'm now translating into non-scientific terms. 10 days after his first fever, Robert's condition worsened significantly. His temperature climbed higher. His complexion turned from rosy to a spectral milky white. And all of this is actually in Farber's paper. He was brought to Children's Hospital in Boston. His spleen, a fist-sized organ that stores and makes blood, usually barely palpable under the rib cage, was visibly enlarged, heaving down like an overfilled bag. A drop of blood under Farber's microscope revealed the identity of his illness, thousands of immature lymphoid leukemic blasts were dividing in a frenzy, their chromosomes condensing and uncondensing like tiny clenched and unclenched fists. Sandler arrived at Children's Hospital just a few weeks after Farber had received his first package from Letterly. We knew that because Yella had kept records of when he sent the packages across to Sidney Farber's hospital. On September 6th, 1947, this is from the paper again, Farber began to inject Sandler with pteroyl aspartic acid, or PAA, the first of Letterly's antifolates. And there's a brackets here. Consent to run a clinical trial for a drug, even a toxic drug, was not required. Parents were occasionally cursorily informed about a trial. Children were almost never informed or consulted. The Nuremberg Code for human experimentation requiring explicit voluntary consent from patients was drafted, interestingly, on August 9th, 1947, less than a month from the PAA trial, from Farber's trial. So Farber's sitting here. The protocols for human voluntary consent are being drafted across the Atlantic. Farber in Boston it is doubtful that Farber in Boston had ever heard of such a required code. He would eventually hear about it, of course. Everyone would eventually hear about it, but there was no such thing. The drug, PAA, had little effect. Over the next month, Sandler turned increasingly lethargic. He developed a limp, the result of leukemia pressing down on his spinal cord. Joint aches appeared and then violent migrating pains. Then the leukemia burst through one of his bones in his thigh, causing a fracture and unleashing a blindingly intense, indescribable pain. By December, the case seemed hopeless. The tip of Sandler's spleen, more dense than ever with leukemic cells, dropped down to his pelvis. He was withdrawn, listless, swollen, and pale, on the verge of death. When Elliot called me up, he said, "How did you know about the bone fracture?" Because his only memory from his childhood, he said, "I have only one memory. We shared a room in Dorchester with two adjacent cots, and they were 3 years old, 2.5 years old." He said, "Much of that is a blur. And maybe even this memory is mythical," but he says there was one night when his brother was so ill and screaming so violently that in fact they had brought in what would be EMTs in that day and age to their home to take the brother to Farber's hospital. In fact, that was the night, probably, most likely that was the night that he had the leukemic fracture. This is a time when leukemia bursts through your bones and actually causes what's called a pathological fracture. On December 28th, however, Farber received a new version of the antifolate from Subarow and Kilty. This one was called aminopterin, a chemical with a small change from the structure of PAA. Farber snatched the drug as soon as it arrived and began to inject the boy with it, hoping at best for a minor reprieve in his cancer. The response was marked. The white cell count, which had been climbing astronomically, 10,000 in September, 20,000 in November, and nearly 70,000 in December, suddenly stopped rising and hovered at a plateau. And then, even more remarkably, the counts actually started to drop, the leukemic blasts gradually flickering out in the blood and then all but disappearing. By New Year's Eve, the count had dropped to nearly 1/6 of its peak value, bottoming out at nearly normal level. The cancer had not vanished. Under the microscope, there were still malignant white cells, but it had temporarily abated, frozen into a hematological stalemate in the frozen Boston winter. On January 13, 1948, again we pick it up from Farber's paper, Sandler returned to the clinic, walking on his own for the first time in 2 months. His spleen and liver had shrunk so dramatically that his clothes, Farber noted, had become loose around the abdomen. His bleeding had stopped. His appetite turned ravenous, as if he were trying to catch up on 6 months of lost meals. By February, Farber noted, the child's alertness, nutrition, and activity were equal to his twins. For a brief month or so, Robert Sandler and Elliot Sandler seemed identical again. So that's the story, and that's a little bit about sort of behind the scenes of what happens when you write a book like this. I'm going to skip forward and introduce you to one major other character, and that is Mary Lasker. And so Farber's emergence from the basement laboratory into the limelight of medicine is in some sense was his first experiment. But Farber performed actually what I call his second experiment. His second experiment, which I think is actually just as crucial and just as important. And this was not an experiment in science, but an experiment in media. And so he realized, having invented essentially these chemotherapeutic drugs, that he needed to launch a national platform, or at least a local platform to begin with, to attack cancer. And he began to then look for collaborators who would allow him to do this. And he found an incredible collaborator early on, and that was the Variety Club of Boston. This was a club of essentially movie makers. Again, the post-war boom in movie making had begun to pour money into the coffers of the Variety Club. These men were becoming very wealthy, and in fact, in their past, they had adopted a child and made children's causes a big part of their general cause. This is the Variety Club. And so Farber thought this was an ideal ally because he could then hook up with the Variety Club and thereby launch a large local platform against cancer. And so he then, again, figuring out the past, figuring out the idea that the Variety Club had acquired this adopted child and thereby created an icon. Farber began to look for his own icon, a child with cancer who would carry the message. And unfortunately, when he went upstairs to his wards, I mean, these were children with leukemia being injected with antifolates, and they were desperately ill. People say they were throwing up, lost their hair, barely able to live, let alone be a vast mascot or an icon for cancer. But there was one child who was not being treated for leukemia, who he found, and this child came from Maine and was being treated for a different cancer. The only problem was his name was Einar Gustafsson. And so partly to conceal his name and partly to give him anonymity, but also partly to create a name that was actually recognizable, Farber rechristened him Jimmy. And so this was the birth of the Jimmy Fund. And by using the Variety Club and by using actually baseball, which was a big Boston phenomenon, remains a big Boston phenomenon, so again, you see Farber's mind at work here. He has a child that he's going to create, anonymize, and make the icon for cancer. But then he quickly leans in and pulls in movies, and then he quickly leans in and he pulls in actually the baseball. Ted Williams, most importantly, there was a change in the history of baseball in Boston, which I won't go into, but Ted Williams eventually. And then he incorporates all of this, he puts it all into a big mixer, and out comes the Jimmy Fund, and it pops out. And within the first few months, it's generated an enormous amount of money for what it was. And so this is Farber's second experiment. And what is happening at this time, of course, is that Farber is emerging himself from the basement into public prominence. And I remember the story about Fanny Rosenau that I told you. That mirrors the emergence of cancer from its basement, as it were, to public prominence, this exact period of time. And that finally tells us why I chose Farber. I chose Farber because of this metaphorical parallel, because his journey out from his basement to the invention of chemotherapy and subsequently to the Jimmy Fund and eventually through Mary Lasker into the public prominence and to the war on cancer is precisely the journey that cancer itself makes in a more metaphorical sense from its hidden in the basement disease that couldn't be talked about to its vast public face today. And that, again, by using Sidney Farber's story, you could then tell the larger story of what was happening to cancer at large. And at that point of time, somewhere, we don't know the exact date, actually, he meets this woman, this magnetic character from New York, Mary Lasker. Mary Lasker was described to me most recently as a woman who had never heard the word no. She was very unusual for her time. She had made a lot of money independently as an entrepreneur. She figured out, actually, just after the war, she figured out that actually in between the wars and after the war, she figured out that women needed to go to work. And her genius was that she began to create what was prefab dresses, pre-cut prefab dresses, so that you wouldn't have to go to your tailor and stitch. You could just go cash and carry, and that was an incredible piece of genius. And of course, you can understand how the history of feminism is already working its way into the history of cancer through Mary Lasker, but ultimately through many other channels. So nonetheless, so Mary Lasker, independently wealthy, marries Albert Lasker, who is an advertising executive, also very wealthy. And Mary Lasker begins to turn her attention onto the war on cancer. She decides that she's going to use all her resources, her philanthropy. She's going to take philanthropy to an enormous new scale, and she's going to lobby Congress to unleash funds for the war on cancer. And she finds in Sidney Farber the ally that she's looking for. I describe it as really the coming together of two halves of a map, because Farber provides the scientific legitimacy, Mary Lasker provides the urgency and the philanthropic energy. And these two things come together, and they really launch. And in the end, they begin to really actively campaign for the war on cancer. And I reproduce, for people of the book, I reproduce this very famous advertisement that they launched in 1969, which says, "Mr. Nixon, you can cure cancer." And at the bottom, it's signed by Lasker and Farber and various other people. And at the bottom, it says, "Why don't we cure cancer for America's 200th birthday? What a wonderful gift that would be." And so right from that advertisement, you understand what's going on. There's a kind of optimism, a kind of hubris. This is America that's just put human beings on the moon, solved the atomic bomb, and therefore the idea that if you pour resources into a project, into a problem, so-called goal-directed or targeted research, you will eventually crack the problem. And cancer, meanwhile, childhood leukemia has been cured by combination chemotherapy, and so they get a real boost to this idea that cancer is basically a puzzle waiting to be solved, and there's a penicillin waiting somewhere. And then from there on, the rest of the book goes on to describe how that picture gets more and more complicated, and advances are made, but that moment of hubris still haunts oncology over and over again. We keep coming back to it to some extent. And one of the things, of course, we realize that there's no one solution. This idea of a penicillin for cancer breaks down, and we begin to understand cancer as a much more complex entity, not as one disease, but as a family of diseases. And we enter that new era finally in the last section of the book, which I will not give away. I'm going to do one more reading, and then I'm going to stop and take questions. And this is from the very last chapter in the book. And Nan, my editor, said to me, it is a golden rule of writing that you never introduce a new character in the last chapter of your book. And she said, well, okay, but for you, one time we'll make an exception. So it turns out that there is a new character, but it's a patient. And, sometimes you write books and you break some rules, and that's fine. So this is a woman who I met actually at the Dana-Farber across town. I was treating her. She had a very aggressive variant of sarcoma, a stomach cancer, and had an incredible response to a new drug, a molecularly targeted drug, a striking response. And then she relapsed. And then she came to Boston around her second relapse to try another experimental drug to see if she could get a third relapse. So this is a real fighter. And a woman whose life had been extended by about 5 or 6 years during this period by a novel experimental drug, but now had relapsed the third time and was no longer treatable. She was actually fine. She had finished her treatment. When I recall that final conversation with Germaine, embarrassingly enough, the objects seemed to stand out more vividly than the words. A hospital room with its sharp smell of disinfectant and hand soap, the steely overhead light, a wooden side table on wheels piled with pills, books, newspaper clippings, jewelry, and postcards. Her room, wallpapered with flowers, wallpapered with pictures of her beautiful house in Montgomery and of her daughter. A standard issue plastic hospital picture filled with a bunch of sunflowers perched on a table by her side. Germaine, as I remember her, was sitting by the bed, one leg dangling casually down, wearing her usual eccentric and arresting combination of clothes and some large and unusual pieces of jewelry. Her hair was carefully arranged. She looked formal, frozen, and perfect, like a photograph of someone in the hospital waiting to die. She seemed content. She laughed and she joked. She made wearing a nasogastric tube seem effortless and somehow dignified. Only years later in writing this book could I finally put into words why that meeting left me so uneasy, why the gestures in that room seemed larger than life, why the objects seemed like symbols, why Germaine herself seemed like an actor playing a part. Nothing, I realized, was incidental. The characteristics of Germaine's personality that had once seemed spontaneous and impulsive were, in fact, calculated and almost reflexive responses to her illness. Her clothes were loose and vivid because they were decoys against the growing outline of the tumor in her abdomen. Her necklace was distractingly large so as to pull attention away from her cancer. Her room was topsy-turvy with baubles and pictures the hospital picture filled with flowers, the cards stacked to the wall, because without them it would devolve into the anonymity of any other room in any other hospital. She had dangled her leg at that precise posed angle because the tumor had invaded her spine and begun to paralyze her other leg, making it impossible for her to sit any other way. Her casualness was studied, her jokes were rehearsed. Her illness had tried to humiliate her. It had made her anonymous and seemingly humorless. It had sentenced her to die an unsightly death in a freezing hospital room thousands of miles away from home. She came from the south. She had responded with a vengeance, moving to be always one step ahead, trying to outwit it. It was like watching someone locked in a chess game. Every time Germain's disease moved, imposing yet another terrifying constraint on her, she made an equally assertive move in return. The illness acted, she reacted. It was a morbid, hypnotic game, a game that had taken over her life. She dodged one blow only to be caught by the other, and she too was like Carol's Red Queen, stuck pedaling furiously just to keep still in one place. Germain seemed that evening to have captured something essential about our struggle against cancer, that to keep pace with this malady, you need to keep inventing and reinventing, learning and unlearning strategies. Germain fought cancer obsessively, cannily, desperately, fiercely, madly, brilliantly, zealously, as if channeling all the fierce inventive energy of generations of men and women who had fought cancer in their past and would fight it in the future. Her quest for a cure had taken her on a strange and limitless journey, through internet blogs and teaching hospitals, chemotherapy and clinical trials halfway across the country, through a landscape more desolate, desperate, and disquieting than she had ever imagined. She had deployed every last morsel of energy to the quest, mobilizing and remobilizing the dregs of her courage, summoning her will and wit and imagination until that final evening she had stared into the vault of her resourcefulness and found it empty. In that last night, hanging on to her life by no more than a tenuous thread, summoning all her strength and dignity as she wheeled herself to the privacy of her bathroom, it was as if she had encapsulated the essence of a 4,000-year-old war. And that's the end of the book. Thank you for coming. So Dana was an important person. He was a funder. He was Charles Dana, and very important in the history of Boston. It was hard to put every character in, as you can imagine, so that's why I didn't put him. So that's the Dana part of the Dana-Farber. Very important character in the history of the Dana-Farber. Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question because, of course, it was Susan Sontag, among others, who first pointed out that there was a punitive quality of a battle metaphor. If you visualize yourself as in a battle against cancer, and you lose that battle, then you become a loser, and therefore all the punitive qualities of that then become burdens for you. My general feeling is Susan is a very important mentor to this book, an invisible mentor, an important mentor, however. My feeling is, in some ways, I wrote the book both as homage but also challenge to Susan, because I feel as if cancer, and this is unusual when you read her book too, I feel as if cancer is a disease replete in metaphors. And getting away from metaphor, I mean, the word cancer comes from crab. It's a metaphorical word. And it's because, as we point out in the book, it's because Hippocrates thought that a tumor was a crab buried under the skin, and the blood vessels around it were the legs of the crab. So right from every piece of language we use around this is metaphorical language. And so there is a sense in which resisting that metaphor becomes itself a battle. And I'll tell you what my personal thoughts about this are. My personal thoughts are, for some patients, a battle metaphor is crucial. For other patients, it's punitive. And I say, if it works for you, and if that's what's needed for your resilience to be to come out, then use it. And if it's not, then don't use it. There is no archetypal battle. There is no archetypal metaphor. And yet, much like there is no archetypal cancer, and there's no archetypal patient, everyone's relationship to the disease is vastly different. And one way I think we can empower ourselves and our patients is to not tell them what metaphors to use, but to allow them to invent their own. And there are plenty to be invented. So that's my long answer to your question. So we work in a team. I see patients half a day a week. I run a laboratory which focuses on leukemia. And my small story about that is, so what happens is that so I have a colleague. We split our patients. But just to give you a sense of what the book tour is like, I was on call through Thanksgiving, and I have always chosen Thanksgiving to be my call time because I was not born in this country. So it felt as if number one, everyone else had to do something, so I might as well be in the hospital. And now it's become very different. Of course, now I have a family, and I'm part of the fabric of this country. And so, but I kept it up as a sort of tradition myself because it's my own way of dealing with Thanksgiving. Yeah, I'm happy to do it. So I landed on the plane from Toronto, and the reason it was in Canada was because they don't have Thanksgiving at the same time. So I landed on the plane in Toronto, and I was immediately on call. So I think what's nice about doing that is that it keeps your perspective. You think you've written a good book, but there are people who have much deeper questions and issues in the hospital. So it was a very good reminder to be humble. I think as far as day-to-day work in patients, I talked a little bit about this earlier. I referred to a little bit about this earlier. I think the understanding the narrative quality of medicine was very crucial. If the one thing that this book reminded me over and over again was that if we lose the narrative quality of medicine, then something will be terribly lost, and we need to restore it. And there are dozens of ways to restore it. One of them is by writing. The other way, there are programs in narrative medicine that allow you to do this. I heard this statistic. Some of you might have heard this number. This was a great and important study when they recorded when scientists or researchers recorded patients giving their stories to doctors and estimated the amount of time when the doctor first interrupts the patient. So how many seconds or minutes occurs between the time you start saying, what's happening, what's your story, why are you here, from that point of time to the first time that a patient is interrupted? Does anyone have a guess? Yeah. So it's 18 seconds. So the number was 18 seconds. It has increased somewhat after that study because it's so embarrassing. But I think the newest numbers are like 21 seconds or 30. That's barely a sentence. I'm not saying that anyone, and I'm sure if you're in medicine, you know that no one is above it. We all interrupt. That is part of part of the profession involves cutting people short because of a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, but it's a reminder for me to resist that force, and it's a reminder that, again, going back to the thought that I had earlier, the shamanic aspects of medicine cannot be replaced. Even if we invent the most incredible pieces of technology, we will be. I can guarantee you that we will be unable to replace the shamanic aspects of medicine, and they are so stitched into our anthropological consciousness that replacing them will really mean the death of human beings. So anyway, I think it's both, because in fact, one of the things that we forget to remember, is that patients also expect a story back from you, and that's very crucial. So much as listening to a story is important, reconstructing your own story of an illness is as important. In fact, that is what one of the practices of medicine is. So in a very abstracted sense, you might imagine that the practice of medicine is a transaction of stories in which you tell me a story and say, this happened to me. And then I tell you, well, here's my return story to you, which explains some of this history. And both of them are not only narrative, but they're a series of hypotheses strung together, right? So I'm saying to you, the way that I view what you just told me is the following. You might come to me and say, well, in fact, I've had a rash for 15 days, and I don't know what happened, et cetera. I went traveling here or came back and did something, and I tell you back a story saying, I think that, in fact, the rash is because you've changed your detergent. Or I think you're having a rash because you traveled to a foreign country and got exposed to this bacteria that you can't even see right now, but if we did the following blood test, we may be able to pick it up. So I think there's a transactional quality about these storytellings, and they happen all the time in medicine. I think that's what's happening. People are constantly exchanging stories. Yeah, I mean, one thing that's important in the book is that Sidney Farber and Mary Lasker are complicated characters. The idea of pushing money onto a problem, throwing money into a problem, didn't necessarily work. And yet, without Sidney Farber and Mary Lasker, we wouldn't be where we are today. So that complexity, conveying that complexity, is itself one of the major efforts in the book. I hope we do. I mean, the question of money is often brought up. I just want to give you a couple of numbers that you might want to think about. The National Cancer Institute budget for this year is about $5 billion. Let's multiply that by 10 because let's multiply 10 because there are clinical trials going on, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So you come to $50 billion. We just spent $1,000 billion on this war. So by whatever account, either that's 20-fold or 200-fold, the number of men and women who will die of cancer in America is 600,000 this year. So it will affect 1 in 4 of us, 1 in 3 of us, depending on how you cut the statistics. So I'm not going to belabor the point that people often say, well, aren't we pouring money into cancer research? Let's keep that into perspective. I agree we are, and I think there needs to be streamlining of resources. Absolutely. Every discipline needs streamlining of resources. But before we lose perspective, those are what the real numbers suggest to us. I'm actually no longer at the Farber. So, but in institutes around the nation, particularly large comprehensive cancer centers, there has been an attempt to create integrative medicine programs, a strong attempt. But that said, the one thing I do feel very strongly about is it's very important that every time we integrate new forms of medicine, we're talking about metaphors, they can become punitive. So here's one that's very, very, very common. You aren't responding well to chemotherapy because you're stressed, right? Or even more acutely, in the 1940s and 1950s, you have cancer because you're overstressed. This was actually the reason that people said people had gastric cancer, right? So I would make a plea to people who practice integrative medicine and other forms of medicine, including surgeons and chemotherapists. Let's not invite another punitive metaphor for a disease that's already burdened with metaphors. I think it's a wonderful thing to have integrative medicine, but if the implication of integrative medicine is, that we're going to now tell patients that unless you go to the acupuncturist, you're not going to get relieved of the stress that is burdening you and making you unable to get chemotherapy or get your surgery. I think that's a very complicated story. So that's my plea to people who practice integrative medicine. Well, I mean, that's a question I think that's sort of beyond the book. One thought that I have about it is that one of the most chilling realizations of cancer biology, which emerged in the 1970s, was that the genes that allow embryos to grow and our hands to grow and our brains to grow, if you mutate and distort those genes, if you activate them or inactivate them, you get cancer. So in other words, you take the genes, and this was a very, very pivotal realization of the 1970s. Before that, we had fantastically hoped or imagined that cancer would only be something exogenous, something coming from outside, like a virus, for instance. The fact that it's not, that in fact it emerges that's stitched into the human chromosome, and it emerges only out of these very genes. Of course, I'm not saying that, carcinogens activate these genes, so there is, of course, a relationship with the environment, with the outside, but there's also the outside impinging on the inside, as it were. And so when you ask the question about purpose, the only thing I can say is that these genes have very vital functions in normal biology, and therefore have a peculiar poise between performing these vital functions and, when they get distorted, becoming cancerous. I don't know if that's a purpose or not, but it certainly tells you why these genes even exist, why cancer is part of our bodies, part of our societies, part of ourselves. Thank you.